a Soldier Field adventure to the Liberty Bowl, where tonight the Chicago Enforcers beat the Memphis Maniacs in a must-win for both teams.
All right, welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the XFL. Of course, we know that the NFL has very strong sort of monopoly on a lot of on football, on American football. It's very dominant. There's been some sort of attempts to compete with it, various leagues. There is a Canadian league, obviously, but nothing's really been able to take hold. And one of the competitors in the past and now currently, and there's new iterations of it coming, is the XFL. And the XFL is unique and interesting in that it's got the component of the WWE and Vince McMahon and that kind of stuff. And so what I wanted to do, I personally had some questions about, okay, well, when did this thing start? How did it happen? How did it get put together? Et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what this podcast is going to be about. It's going to be about the XFL, more on the formation, on the initial season, that kind of stuff, than on the current. Basically a little history on the XFL. So here we go.
Ready? And there is the scramble. And Memphis, Raphael Cooper winning the scramble for Memphis. And that's going to give Memphis the opportunity to kick, receive, defend the goal of their choice, or defer, Dick.
All right. Well, what you just heard there was an excerpt from their inaugural season of the XFL, which was in the year 2001. And in that season, they played a full season. And after that was disbanded, at least as far as playing a full slate of games. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back a little bit before 2001 and talk a bit about the formation and a bit about what was driving that formation and how that happened. So let's shift back. Vince McMahon was wildly successful in the WWE. The WWE, of course, uses storylines. They call it kayfabe or fakeness as sort of a predetermined storyline, predetermined battles, beefs between people. And he was very successful with that with the WWE. And in 2001 or 2099, this type of time, this was before all of the CTE came out and this sort of the issues that the NFL and the football could have with CTE. Now a lot of the sort of hard-hitting and showmanship has been pulled back. That would be hard-hitting and showmanship that you find in the WWE, you would find in football. So in this time, in 99, 2000, this type of time, CTE hadn't come to the forefront. Basically, people really didn't even know about it. So WWE, the wrestling, the theatrics of it, really aligned in some ways with football and with the NFL. And that's what Vince McMahon saw. And he wanted to get involved in football and see what he could bring to the table from that WWE component, this sort of played up battles and some of that he thought would work well with football. And of course, the NFL was a very dominant franchise, and he wanted to get involved in that. So Vince McMahon had initially looked into purchasing the Canadian Football League and actually bringing them south to the United States. That didn't play out, of course. And again, this is this kind of 99 time frame, kind of right around the turn of the 21st century. So that coincided with NBC actually losing their broadcast rights to the NFL's AFC to CBS. There's a bunch of words for you, but so the NBC had lost their, in a sort of a bidding war, they had lost their broadcast rights for the AFC to CBS. And they were in talks with, which were spearheaded by Ted Turner of Time Warner Sports. NBC was in talks with Time Warner Sports to actually go ahead and try to create their own league to have a product to broadcast that would compete with the NFL. Both Vince McMahon's look at trying to bring the Canadian Football League south and NBC and Time Warner's deal fell apart. And they found themselves looking as potential partners. So Vince McMahon and WWE And then you've got NBC, which at the time was actually a subsidiary of General Electric, which many people forget about. General Electric obviously had its kind of recent past where it's been trying to pay down debt, and it's not quite the behemoth that it was before. But in this time and sort of under Jack Welch, General Electric was buying all kinds of things. They were in many different areas. It's even referenced in the 1994 Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. Buffett sort of compares Berkshire in some ways to General Electric and what Jack Welch was doing there. So it had many different components, many different pieces. And one of the things that General Electric owned was NBC. And NBC hadn't really broadcast football. It looked like they hadn't broadcasted football since 97, 98. And we're looking for a product to be able to broadcast. So there's the Time Warner Sports deal that NBC was looking at working with, and that fell through, and they shifted to work with Vince McMahon of WWE. Now, we forget in today's day and age that the WWE was kind of like rap music. It was really sort of frowned upon. It was kind of a hide your wife, hide your kids kind of thing with WWE. Some of the language was vulgar. It was really something that at the time was not viewed as sort of up to NBC and General Electric standards. An example, there was a New York Post article at the time in April of 2000 that said, quote, NBC makes deal with the devil. And so there was that kind of bad boy aura, all of those kind of components. And that was something that actually Vince McMahon, intended to use in the XFL and sort of in separating it in some ways from the NFL to give it some distinct competitive advantage and not just be a direct competitor in football to this entrenched dominant entity in the NFL. So NBC and WWE came together and formed a partnership. The mechanics of the deal, according to CNN Money, NBC would purchase a 3% stake in the WWE for $30 million. And this would be done via newly issued Class A common stock under this WWFE ticker at the time. And this newly issued stock would be issued at $13 per share. And in the deal, and this is kind of the overarching, we're going to go through some of the more details from the actual filing in a second here, but they would be 50-50 owners, and NBC would air the XFL games on Saturday nights all the way through their championship game in April. Again, high level, it would be set up where it would be a single entity in that the XFL would own all of the teams. They would not be separate franchises like in the NFL. So just really quickly, in the NFL, the teams, sort of the bulk of the equity of the NFL is within these franchise teams, and the NFL sort of just sits at the top and orchestrates the ins and the outs of the franchise, allows them to come in, allows them to come out, watches competition, makes sure that one franchise doesn't have an unfair advantage, all of those kinds of things, enforces rules, enforces fines, and again, we have a whole episode on it. It does have some like loan facilities and things for the teams, but not to go into the detail, basically a lot of the equity of the NFL resides in these individually owned franchises, whereas the XFL was set up where each of the teams would be owned by the XFL. It would be sort of a single company. And again, NBC would own 50% of that. So now we'll go into a little more detail from the XFL LLC, which is what was formed from their filing, and then we'll talk a little bit about the XFL itself. So from its filing, the mechanics of the funding were as follows. So the XFL LLC was set up. There was an initial capital contribution of $2.5 million from NBC and of $2.5 million and $12.50. We'll get to that in a second, by the WWE. And then there was a policy that there would be a monthly meeting of the managers, and letters would be sent out to the two parties or additional parties in the future as capital was needed. So there would be capital calls sent out going forward. the capital contributions and the arrangement of stock or of units, I guess, that were given to each party are as follows. So you had 200,000 Class A membership units. Again, units versus shares, that's just an LLC thing. And those were issued and held by WWFE. And then they had a maximal issuing authority of 800,000 membership units in that Class A. And then there were 200,000 Class B units issued and held by NBC with an authority to issue up to 400,000 units. And then there was one Class C unit issued and held by WWFE, with that being the only unit in that class to be issued. And that was what that $12.50 was for, literally $12.50. That was what was paid for the Class C share by WWFE. And the Class C membership share, again, this $12.50 share, was set up where there was kind of a guaranteed return for that share. So the way it reads is basically it's a priority return share. And in this case, it was defined as 10% over a 365-day period. And that would be issued to that Class C share if there was a scenario where less than that was distributed in the fiscal year. So they would basically, that share guaranteed a 10% return, and the membership unit, again, cost $12.50. And just a note, I think I might have that later on in here, but just a note, if they ever went public, that share would be eliminated. Purchase, paid for, eliminated, and taken away. So you would only have the other classes in a going public scenario. Again, there was, and this is pretty standard, but there were provisions issued where if a party, did not meet the capital call, if they didn't come to the table with the capital, then there would be additional shares issued to the non-defaulting party. So if the capital call comes in, the party does not issue the capital, then it's a default on that capital call. The non-defaulting party would get issued more shares. Again, right of first refusal for the parties involved. The Class B membership units, which were Class A, the WWFE had, the Class B, NBC had, the Class C, again, WWFE had. The Class B shares were non-voting interests. And then the Class A was more of just kind of your general standard, interest, LLC interest. And those Class B units can be converted at the holder's option to Class A shares, to voting shares, with a 1-year notice given. So that was kind of the initial setup, was that there would be the Class B non-voting. It would go to NBC. Class A would go to WWFE. Class C, again, to WWFE. So as Class A was voting, Class B was non-voting, Class C was a guaranteed 10% return effectively. WWFE had a call option, NBC had a put option. That's kind of how they were set up. And over that first year, it's reported that the entities together put in $100 million into the venture total. Yeah, so a little bit about the games. As I mentioned before, Vince McMahon wanted to differentiate the product a little bit from pure football. It used a lot of elements of the WWE. They had announcers from the WWE come over. They had fake battles. They had cheerleaders that wore less clothes than the NFL cheerleaders. Again, they had this sort of kayfabe element where there were fake battles, storylines throughout the games, and then they had things like, instead of a kickoff or a flip the coin, they'd throw the ball in the middle and let people fight over it. And there was playing up of the hits and the tackles and all of that kind of stuff, which quite honestly the NFL was doing at that time as well. But there was a real push in that sense. And obviously the current iteration will step away from that in a lot of ways because of the concussion situation and the things we know about concussions. But there were also some good things that they did, and that things that sort of that the NFL adopted in the future. One thing that they did was there was no point after touchdown attempt, so no PAT. It was viewed as sort of boring and, just sort of a foregone conclusion. And of course, that's something that the NFL has shared since 2001 as well. They have basically moved back the PAT to make it a lower percentage chance that you get it, etc. The XFL also used a Skycam for the first time. They had player microphones, which the NFL had not done yet. So a lot of the sort of entertainment aspect they wanted to try to maximize, right? Any little area of the NFL game, because they sort of had this freedom and this new blueprint, they wanted to maximize it. They wanted, to bring you in there. You could hear the players, talk and cuss and all this stuff. And then you could hear the hits better and all of that kind of stuff. And then any areas like a kickoff, like a PAT, they were pulling those out so that you could have a much more action-packed game. So how did it go? Basically, it went all right initially. So initially, the ratings were not that bad. The first game actually had kind of respectable ratings. But as the season went along, the ratings declined to the point where sort of towards the end of the season, there were games that were getting a 1.5 rating. There was stiff competition from some NCAA basketball and different things like that. And so, the attendance in the stands was not bad. They actually only sort of missed the NFL attendance by about 10%. But the TV ratings just were not going to work. And again, in that initial XFL LLC setup where NBC was a 50% partner, it was supposed to be a 2.5 year deal. But after the first season, NBC said, we're done. We're not going to broadcast the second season. So with that being said, obviously Vince McMahon and WWE had control of the XFL and they shopped it to several other networks. But again, they wouldn't pick it up. So the league was shelved, obviously, with Vince McMahon still maintaining ownership. But again, NBC and WWE really only recouping about 30% of their investment. Again, losing $35 million each when they basically only put in $50 million. But there was some uniqueness to it. It was football and in the off season of football, and but again, with the WWE tinge, a lot of the sports media didn't really respect it, and a lot of the analysts on ESPN and Sports Illustrated really didn't discuss it. And so that's been a thought of, it didn't really have that space. It wasn't full-blown, kayfabe, and it wasn't full-blown football, and it really didn't have a spot. Now, as they do the new iteration, with The Rock involved as an owner, they're going to try to make it a little bit more pure football and maybe find a place for winter football, off-season football, development football, something where there's a little more sport respect, a little less WWE, hopefully less CTE, and still try to find its place in the football ecosystem. Because right now there's really one place. There's NCAA football, and then there's the NFL. And there's a thought that potentially winter football, potentially some developmental football, potentially something to compete initially with the Canadian Football League and then more closely to the NFL might work. Who knows? Again, we've talked about it several different times in several different ways on this podcast that the NFL is really king. It's king in terms of its earnings. It's king in terms of the franchise values. And even in this, 1998, 97 time, the TV deal, I think, was, just to give you an idea, again, we've discussed this before, but, in 1998, the total money paid by Fox, CBS, and ABC, again, according to CNN Money, was $17.6 billion in 1998. So, these deals with the NFL are record setting. And if anytime there's that type of a situation, there's going to be competitors coming out. Now, the NFL's been so dominant that it's been extremely tough for that to happen. So we'll see what the future brings for the XFL. But again, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the original XFL, when did it happen? How did it happen? What was it like? And just a little bit about it. So hope you enjoyed that, and we will talk to you next time. Thanks so much.